Hey guys, tonight we're diving literally into a part of Greek mythology so profoundly uneventful, so subtly absurd, that your brain may shut off from sheer confusion. We're talking about a 3-day argument between Poseidon, god of the sea, and a clam, not a clam army, not a magical clam. Just one singular clam, motionless, minding its business, but in the wrong place at the wrong divine time. You're about to enter a realm where salt isn't just in the water, it's in every word, glance, and condescending bubble between an immortal sea deity and a mollusk with commitment issues. The seafloor is quiet. The light filters down in soft turquoise shafts, and the only sound is the occasional grumpy grunt from Poseidon, adjusting his trident for dramatic effect. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, post your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where in the world you're winding down from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You hover somewhere off the coast of ancient Thalassia, not on any modern map, but definitely the kind of place that shows up in lost scrolls and obscure footnotes. The water smells like iron and brines. Somewhere to your left, a crab is sharpening the stick for reasons no one will ever understand. Poseidon, for his part, is already annoyed. His beard is tangled with kelp. His seahorse entourage has abandoned him for lunch, and someone round and closed and smug is sitting precisely where the sunbeam touches the thermal vent. His sunbeam, his vent, it's not just territorial, it's the principle. Because this isn't just any clam, it's wide, old, and possibly humming. The kind of mollusk that has seen empires rise and fall and has remained absolutely unimpressed. The kind of creature that, without speaking, makes you feel small, mortal, and slightly overdressed. Poseidon glares, the clam does not move. You begin to understand the tension. Imagine if you came home to find a stranger reclining on your favorite armchair with the TV remote resting delicately on their belly, and then they blinked at you as if you were the intrusion. For the next 12 minutes, give or take, Poseidon circles. He kicks up silt in big angry spirals. He summons a mini whirlpool that dances in place, as if to say, "Look what I can do." The clam remains unmoved. In fact, it seems to sink slightly deeper into the sand, like it's settling in for a nap during Poseidon's tantrum. A merman drifts by carrying a bundle of sea scrolls, glances at the scene, and paddles quickly in the opposite direction. You don't blame him. At this point, Poseidon has begun muttering insults like overgrown soap dish and barnacle buffet. None of them land. The clam is serene, disrespectfully serene. And then, it happens. Poseidon jabs the end of his trident into the sand just beside the clam. Not at the clam. Of course, he's still technically upholding the divine non-aggression pact passed by the Olympus Shell Accords 438 BCE. Or so we think, but he implies damage, suggests violence. Like a god slamming the brakes without actually honking, the clam blinks once. Then, in a move that historians still argue whether to interpret as passive-aggressive or saintly restraint, it emits a small bloop. Just one, it echoes longer than it should. Poseidon narrows his eyes. "You mock me." The clam bloops again. Mainstream scholars say this moment marks the official start of the argument, citing ancient inscriptions on Etruscan conch shells that depict Poseidon gesturing dramatically at what appears to be a low-slung oyster. But fringe theorists, particularly the school of Delphi deniers, suggest this entire episode was a metaphor for land disputes between rival coastal temples, or possibly a bedtime fable created by exhausted fishmongers. You float above them, the current lazy and lukewarm, listening to Poseidon start reciting the ancient laws of aquatic sovereignty. Section 4 of the Tethys Compact clearly states that all geothermal vents within 600 sandspans of the Trident axis fall under my jurisdiction. The clam closes its shell a little tighter. Somewhere above, a tuna sighs. It's going to be a long 3 days. Poseidon is not accustomed to being ignored. When mortals ignore him, he drowns their harbors. When gods ignore him, he floods their temples or worse, sends a polite letter to Zeus, which always results in awkward family dinners. But when a clam ignores him, that's something new. It's not even defiance. It's indifference. And nothing infuriates a god faster than being treated like background noise. You drift closer, just enough to catch the tension in Poseidon's shoulders as he circles again, pacing in slow orbits. The sand rises with each of his dramatic footfalls, puffing up like underwater fog. The clam doesn't budge. Its shell is perfectly symmetrical, polished by time, layered with delicate barnacle filigree. Poseidon snorts. "Oh, I see," he mutters. "You think you're decorative." He's talking to himself now, but loudly enough that the clam must hear it. "Well, let me tell you something. You lowly, filter-feeding rock with dreams, that's my sunlight, my vent, and you're trespassing." You'd think the clam might quiver, twitch, retract into the sand in shame or fear. But no. In one graceful motion, if you can call it that, it rotates ever so slightly to face Poseidon more squarely. And then, in a tone so silent it's practically telepathic, the clam seems to say, "I was here first." Poseidon freezes. The sea hushes. Even a nearby flounder ceases its unconvincing camouflage performance to witness what might be history's most passive insult. The kind that doesn't slap you. It invites you to slap yourself. "You dare..." Poseidon begins, his voice rumbling like a distant storm. "To claim temporal rights against me, I forged this trench with my own trident after a poorly judged bet with Hades. This is true. By the way, historical records found in the scroll fragments of Plakia mention a drink and strike challenge, wherein Poseidon attempted to carve the Aegean floor to resemble a profile of his own face. He got as far as the nose ridge before passing out in a sponge bed. Some features remain visible on clear days, if you squint hard and are extremely generous with interpretation, but the clam is not moved by facial geography or divine vanity. Instead, it opens slightly just enough to release a burst of warm bubbles and then closes again. The bubbles rise like punctuation, vague and mocking. Poseidon takes it as an insult. "Oh, you want to talk about polish? I've seen more charisma in a sea urchin's sneeze." He doesn't yell. Not exactly. His voice is more of a force of nature, like when the tide gets angry at cliffs. You feel it in your ribs. A few shells nearby rattle. One shrimp faints. And yet... The clam blinks again, and finally, it speaks, not with words. Of course, no one knows if clams can form syllables, much less sarcasm. But this particular mollusk lifts its upper shell half a fraction more and releases a single, slow, echoing glurg. The sound of someone too bored to bother. The sound of divine disrespect. Poseidon reels back, hand to chest, like he's been pierced through the heart. "You dare call me predictable?" Again, the clam says nothing. It doesn't need to. The echo still hangs in the water like stale perfume. The two of them stare, one with divine fury, the other with absolutely zero emotional bandwidth. And you watch this ancient underwater standoff while seaweed sways like disinterested spectators. The only real movement is a traveling pod of jellyfish, migrating silently past with a look that says, "Oh, not again." You wonder, has this happened before? Historians still argue whether this was the first Poseidon versus mollusk incident or merely the most documented. Some scrolls from Lesbos reference a similar quarrel between Poseidon and a sea sponge that absorbed the echo of one of his prophecies and refused to release it. That argument reportedly lasted 6 days and ended with a hurricane and a very confused dolphin. But this is personal. You can feel it. Poseidon crouches low now, whispering menacingly. "Look, I can let you off easy. Just scoot one sand grain to the left. One, and I'll pretend this never happened." The clam, unmoved, stays centered in the beam of light. You're not sure, but you think it might actually have shifted deeper into the glow. Poseidon rises slowly, dramatically, dragging his trident along the seafloor, leaving a shallow furrow behind him. He turns his back to the clam, but not in surrender. No, this is a power move. A strategic silence. The most passive-aggressive of all ancient tactics. For the next hour, neither speaks. The sun shifts just slightly overhead. A slow current rolls in, bringing the scent of volcanic sediment and something faintly metallic. It smells like old coins and pride. You hover between them, utterly caught in the absence of sound. It's a vacuum of pettiness. A thunderous stillness where each second feels like a year. It's beautiful in the way only awkward tension can be. You exhale. You are now entering the quietest part of the underwater argument. Not because things have settled, no, quite the opposite. This is the eye of the storm, the passive-aggressive calm, a cold war conducted through narrowed glances and increasingly theatrical silences. 3 full hours pass without a single word. Not one insult, not one glurg, but make no mistake, the battle continues. Just quietly, Poseidon has now positioned himself exactly 1 trident's length from the Clam, floating just off the seafloor in a slow, moody hover. His arms are crossed. His trident sulking beside him spins slightly in the current like a bored baton. Every few minutes, he clears his throat, loudly, then more loudly, then again, but this time with extra reverb. The Clam, still unmoving, still glowing in that sacred shaft of filtered sunlight. It appears to be asleep or worse, meditating. You settle on a rock that feels like it might have been part of an ancient statue's elbow. Tiny crabs scurry across it, and one of them stops to glare at you like you've sat on something important. You apologize in your mind. The crab doesn't accept. Back in the spotlight, Poseidon is now muttering to himself in ancient Dorian, something about shell symmetry, inheritance rights, and disrespectful shellfish. He sighs, flips his seaweed cape, and mutters, "I've defeated titans, I've tamed storms, I invented horses, and now I'm being ignored by a soup ingredient." The Clam offers no rebuttal, but you're beginning to suspect that's the point. Historians still argue whether this specific silence was part of the Clam's tactical advantage. Some believe it's a unique form of molluscan communication designed to trigger existential crises in louder species. Fringe theorists, however, think the Clam was simply asleep. But this isn't the kind of sleep you or I know. No gentle dreams or drifting thoughts. This is what philosophers might call oceanic detachment, a meditative state somewhere between sleep, protest, and high-level pettiness. The Clam is, quite possibly, fasting in defiance. Poseidon, of course, doesn't see it that way. After the 3rd hour of silence, he can't take it anymore. He stands, if floating a few feet higher can be called standing, and bellows. "Fine, I shall speak first. This is a lie." He's been speaking for the last 4 hours, but he seems to believe this declaration gives him the moral high ground. I, Poseidon, master of seas, breaker of floodgates, friend of the octopus, do hereby offer this moment of dialogue to the mute mollusk who dares squat upon my geothermal seat. You wince, even underwater. The drama is heavy. Still, the Clam doesn't respond. And Poseidon, flustered but too proud to back out now, begins what scholars later referred to as the Trident monologue. It's long. It's rambling. It includes at least 4 tangents. One about jellyfish, zoning violations, one about the inferiority of coral furniture, and a particularly emotional segment on how amphora shapes have become too derivative. You drift slightly backward, caught in the sonic undertow of Poseidon's ego spiral. Behind you, 2 eels whisper to each other in snake-like clicks. One says, "Not this again." The other nods and slinks off to nap behind a kelp curtain. By the end of hour 4, Poseidon has reached what scholars call the bargaining phase. "Listen," he says, more gently now, "you don't even look like you belong here. You're a lagoon type, a shallow-water soft silt dweller. This is volcanic territory. Geysers, heat plumes, prestige." The Clam opens just a hair. Poseidon squints. Did it just flinch? Was that a signal? The Clam promptly releases a slow bubble. Just one. It floats upward, unbothered, and you watch as it passes a confused starfish, bounces once off Poseidon's shoulder, and pops on a passing barnacle. This is not progress. Poseidon, deflated, collapses onto a ridge of basalt and stares off into the blue. You can almost hear the godly gears in his head turning. Somewhere above, a manta ray glides by like a silent judge, unimpressed by both parties. You wonder what's the goal here. Is Poseidon trying to win the argument, or just to be acknowledged? That's the thing about underwater standoffs. There's no scoreboard, just shifting tides and unresolved resentment. Historians still argue whether this precise moment of stillness between bubble and sigh, is where the true myth begins. The earlier versions of sunbeams and vent squatting may just be set up, but this a god of storms paralyzed by a mollusk's silence is the real story. One that has echoed through fish schools and eel dens and sponge fields for millennia. You check on Poseidon again. He's now talking to his trident. The trident doesn't answer. Of course, this is when the passive aggression starts to evolve. Silence is no longer enough. Now, Poseidon begins to manipulate the sea itself not aggressively, but just enough to annoy. He tweaks the currents so that every few minutes, a puff of silt drifts directly into the clam's breathing zone. He makes the water just a touch warmer, just slightly off comfort. He adjusts the wave pattern so the sunlight beam wobbles only subtly, but enough to make the clam's afternoon nap less enjoyable. The clam, unmoved, its serenity has reached dangerous levels, and you, caught between a sulking god and an unyielding mollusk, realize this may be one of the longest and most emotionally complex arguments in divine history. And we're only just getting started. Poseidon's mood is now somewhere between sulking teenager and disgruntled HOA president. He's shifted from grand proclamations to subtle sabotage, creating little eddies that spin bits of kelp directly into the clam's breathing aperture. One by one, the leaves collect, annoying, itchy, a passive-aggressive bouquet of ocean debris, and still, the clam does not move. You can almost hear the internal dialogue Poseidon's having. It's the same one gods have right before smiting villages or flooding vineyards. The kind that starts with, "I am being very reasonable," and ends with, "and then I turned his olive grove into a squid farm." Instead, Poseidon channels his irritation into something more refined. Manipulation. He adjusts the water temperature, again, not enough to boil, just enough to cause discomfort. The light filters down in anxious colors now, a greenish tint you associate with bad weather or the moment before someone says something they can't take back. You're close enough to see his fingers twitch. He's trying to resist using divine force, but just barely. Then, he does something unexpected. He smiles. It's not pleasant. It's the kind of smile people wear when they say, "Oh, no, it's fine." But you know, it's very much not fine. You feel a chill, which is strange. Given that you're underwater near a thermal vent, Poseidon drifts a little higher and announces, "Very well, if we're to engage in this petty, silent war, then I shall escalate accordingly." The clam twitches slightly, just barely, perhaps not out of concern, but more like adjusting its internal sarcasm settings. Poseidon raises a hand and flicks the tip of his trident. Instantly, the current shifts, and from behind a distant coral shelf comes a slow procession. Jellyfish, not ordinary ones. These are the kind that glow with uncertain purpose, the kind that look like they might be artists or critics. Dozens of them float into view like an interpretive ballet, each one pulsing in slow, deliberate waves. They begin to dance. It's subtle. At first, a ripple of color here, a shimmer of bioluminescence there, but then it becomes coordinated and underwater stage show, synchronized to Poseidon's increasingly theatrical hand gestures. One jellyfish pirouettes, another flashes red in a rhythmic pattern. You realize what's happening. Poseidon has summoned a chorus. This is no longer a private dispute. It's now performance art. The jellyfish swirl in circles around the clam, pulsating in patterns that somehow convey mockery. You don't understand jellyfish humor. No one really does. But you can tell it's not flattering. The clam, however, remains still. Poseidon starts narrating, translating the jellyfish gestures aloud for dramatic effect. Lo, the great bivalve of entitlement, guardian of the shallow light, refuses divine relocation orders. What injustice! What gall! You blink slowly. Is this a jellyfish opera? Yes, it is. You watch as one particularly expressive jellyfish drifts up and flashes a series of pulsing green and orange bursts that, to Poseidon, clearly mean he hath overstayed his welcome. But to you, it just looks like a migraine in slow motion. The clam finally reacts, not with violence. Of course, not even sound. Instead, it releases a small puff of ink, just enough to cloud one jellyfish, who spins dramatically and floats away, clearly injured in a theatrical sort of way. Another jellyfish follows suit, and soon the whole ensemble begins reenacting a tragic war scene. It's melodramatic, it's weirdly moving. It's also completely ineffective. Poseidon claps once, beautiful, utterly beautiful, and entirely wasted on this ingrate mollusk. The clam yawns. That's the only word for it. The upper shell lifts in a wide arc, then slowly closes again. The timing is brutal, dismissive. It's the underwater version of checking your watch during someone's wedding toast. Poseidon's eye twitches. He spins towards you suddenly, as if only just realizing there's an audience. You freeze. He squints. Are you with him? You blink, unsure how to answer. He gestures wildly. You're just floating there like a sponge with anxiety. Are you part of this conspiracy? You try to shake your head. It's unclear if the motion translates well underwater, but Poseidon grumbles something about witnesses and resumes pacing. Meanwhile, the jellyfish begin improvising. One does a slow death spiral, another flashes blue 3 times and then flops over dramatically. You suspect none of this is choreographed anymore. Historians still argue whether the jellyfish chorus was an ancient form of sea satire or if it was just Poseidon projecting. Fringe archaeologists claim to have found shell carvings that depict similar jellyfish ballets performed to distract sea monsters during divine negotiations. But these sources are slimy. You lean back on your elbow rock and sigh. This whole situation has spiraled from a territorial misunderstanding into a full-blown one-man pageant with interpretive dancers. And still, the clam does not budge. Poseidon stops. He exhales deeply, and in a voice quieter than before, he mutters, "Why won't he just move?" The jellyfish drift away, confused and bored. One of them accidentally bumps into Poseidon's trident and zaps itself into oblivion. No one notices. You settle in. It's going to be a long night. By now, the water has that unmistakable tension of a dinner party, where someone brought up politics 3 bites into the appetizer. You drift near a patch of sleepy anemones, who are doing their best to ignore the emotional fallout spiraling around Poseidon. One of them shudders when the god groans loudly and announces, to no one in particular, "Well, clearly, I'm the only one willing to be mature here." The clam, as usual, says nothing, but then perhaps to Poseidon's horror, a new element enters the scene, slowly drifting in from the southwest trench like they've heard rumors of drama and want front-row seats. Come the jellyfish chorus again, but this time they've brought friends, squid, flatfish, a gossiping octopus with a clipboard. You recognize the signs. Word has gotten out. Poseidon's petty standoff has become the underwater event of the season. You glance at the octopus. He's sketching something. Either it's a caricature of Poseidon or a sea cucumber. Either way, it doesn't look flattering. A cluster of parrotfish gathers at a safe distance, whispering in bubbles and side eyes. Someone's even brought snacks, specifically fermented seaweed wrapped in algae. You wonder if it's a potluck. Poseidon, visibly rattled, turns and hisses, "I don't remember inviting a peanut gallery." "Technically, we're algae-based," says the octopus, not looking up. Now Poseidon is surrounded, not by enemies, but by spectators, and worst of all, critics. He straightens his beard, summons a new gust of current for dramatic effect, and attempts to reclaim control. "Everyone settle down," he commands. "This is a legal matter of divine property rights and mollusk misconduct." Silence. Then a faint slapping sound as a stingray facepalms against the sand. You'd think Poseidon would be embarrassed, but no. He takes this as a cue to lecture. For those just joining us, he says with too much volume, "This humble clam here has refused to vacate a geothermal vent clearly designated for divine use under Clause 7, Subsection 12 of the Ancient Oceanic Sovereignty Agreement, as inscribed on the coral tablets of Delphi, which, by the way, I helped edit." Historians still argue whether these tablets ever existed. Most surviving coral fragments from Delphi just include menus and a suspicious number of conch-based cocktail recipes. But Poseidon continues unfazed. "Let the record show that I have been more than reasonable offering silence, dialogue, interpretive jellyfish, and a full musical number." Yet he remains lodged, unyielding, ungrateful. At this point, a dolphin squeaks out something rude in its native dialect. Poseidon glares. And just when you think things can't get more surreal, they do, because suddenly, out of the deeper trench beyond the volcanic shelf comes a voice. Lunchtime. You turn. Floating in with all the elegance of a sponge in a top hat is a long, glistening sea turtle pushing a cart made of driftwood and coral. On it, little bowls of mashed kelp, brined sea snails, and what appears to be salted olive pits arranged in the shape of Poseidon's beard. It's ceremonial, weirdly festive, and 100% unasked for. Poseidon stares. "We're taking a break," he asks, genuinely confused. The turtle shrugs. "You've been yelling at a clam for 6 hours. You need protein." To your shock, Poseidon agrees, and so the lunch break begins. You watch as Poseidon sulks over his meal, slowly chewing a sea snail while eyeing the clam like it might suddenly stand up and recite poetry. He sips from a goblet made from a hollowed-out pufferfish. The clam, meanwhile, appears to be asleep again, or at least pretending to be. The subtle art of passive resistance. At one point, Poseidon tries to make conversation. "Did you know I once invented salt?" This is false. Salt predates Poseidon by several billion years, but the crowd nods politely. No one wants to be smited during snack time. Fringe scholars sometimes reference this moment as a turning point where the argument transcended words and entered the realm of symbolism. The clam, refusing food, became a living metaphor for spiritual detachment. Poseidon, chewing aggressively on a fermented sea cucumber, embodied the desperation of gods who demand relevance from those who simply aren't interested. You bite into a piece of kelp offered by a passing moray eel. It tastes like damp ambition. A crab drops a napkin. A jellyfish sneezes. The moment passes, and just when it seems like things might de-escalate, like Poseidon might actually consider ignoring the clam and moving on, he leans forward and squints. The clam has done something. It's hard to say what exactly. It hasn't moved. But the shadow it casts on the sand now resembles Poseidon's trident. Not perfectly, but enough to be unsettling. Poseidon drops his goblet. The crowd gasps. The turtle sighs and starts packing up the snack cart. Poseidon stands again, slowly, eyes narrowing. "You mock me." During my lunch break, the clam is silent. The ocean holds its breath, and you're still not entirely sure if this is a diplomatic dispute or an elaborate performance piece. Feel that strange tingle of myth in the water, that deep, ancient energy that says something incredibly stupid is about to happen. The underwater arena has shifted. The lunch is over. The pleasantries are gone. And Poseidon now stands, or rather floats, with renewed, salt-infused determination. The snack break, it seems, was not refreshing. It was a trap, a moment of reflection that allowed the full depth of the insult to settle in. That shadow, the trident-like outline cast by the clam, wasn't just a trick of the light, it was a statement. And Poseidon took it personally. You hover nearby, arms folded. As the sea darkens just slightly, the water thickening with the mood, somewhere overhead, a tuna makes the smart decision to evacuate. The jellyfish chorus has lost interest and are now slow dancing with themselves in a corner trench. Even the parrotfish have gone quiet, munching algae with the awkward tension of people chewing chips during a funeral. Poseidon approaches the clam again, and then, for the first time in nearly 10 hours, the clam speaks. Not with words, never with words. It opens slowly, smoothly, and emits a soft, resonant chug-chug glurg, followed by a low-pitched hum that reverberates across the seafloor like a distant foghorn with trust issues. Poseidon stops mid-step. "Excuse me," he says, his voice tinged with disbelief. The clam does it again. Chug-chug glurg. Then closes, not loudly, not dramatically, just definitively. You're not sure what it meant, but Poseidon looks like he just got roasted by a barnacle in front of his crush. He sputters. "That's your opening statement." The crowd leans in. Poseidon swirls his trident, creating a slow vortex that spins a few rocks into orbit. "Very well, I see you're ready to begin formal proceedings. I will respond with legal precision." And then he clears his throat and begins what is clearly a rehearsed speech. "I, Poseidon, son of Cronus, ruler of the sea and an occasional inventor of dramatic pause, do hereby invoke Article 9 of the ancient Undersea Convention on Territorial Occupancy, also known as the Sardine Treaty of Thalassia, which clearly states, he stops, looks around. His voice drops an octave, that all underwater heat vents, within a 4-trident radius of a divine signature, are sacred property of the ruling god whose trident touched them first. You blink. Even the sea urchins look skeptical. Historians still argue whether this treaty ever existed. Some ancient fragments describe it as more of a dinner argument between a sardine priest and a slightly drunk Poseidon, but Poseidon has always insisted it was ratified by an eel council. Fringe scholars believe the treaty was scrawled on a leaf and then immediately eaten by a crab. Poseidon presses on. I forged this trench. I meditated upon it. I sweat divine droplets into the soil. He pauses, then corrects himself. Figuratively, gods don't sweat. The clam lets out one single, disrespectful bubble. Poseidon twitches. Oh, you think that's funny? You think this is all just a game to you? He spins around and waves a hand. Fine. Maybe we need a neutral third party. Q, the sea cucumber. He doesn't enter so much as exist. Already there, as if he's always been, slowly sliding into frame. The sea cucumber is ancient, lumpy, respected. His name is simply Orpheus. No one knows what species he is exactly. He might not even be a cucumber. But he is old, older than sea salt, older than Poseidon's dignity. And when he speaks, it is with a tone that feels like it's been traveling for 6 centuries just to say, I was napping. Orpheus blinks very slowly. His eyes move in different directions. Why? He asks in a tone flatter than the sea floor. Are you yelling at a clam? Poseidon points his trident. He's in my spot. Orpheus blinks again. Did you pay for it? I know. I am a god. So, you're squatting. The entire sea gasps. A hermit crab faints. You think a seahorse chokes on its own bubble? Poseidon stammers. I am entitled. Orpheus holds up what might be a flipper. No one is entitled, son. You either flow or you don't. Is it wisdom? Is it sleep deprivation? Unclear. Poseidon glances at the clam. The clam has opened slightly, just enough to show the faint gleam of pearl. Not a threat, more like a yawn wearing a crown. Orpheus drifts off mid-sentence, already forgetting why he was summoned. You watch as he slowly flips over and disappears into the trench like a soggy nap. Poseidon is stunned. That's your mediator. A sea sausage who lectures in riddles and then falls asleep. No response. Not from the crowd, not from the clam. The god breathes heavily, his chest rising with the currents, beard floating in sulky spirals. His trident pulses faintly, reacting to his mood. You hear him mutter, almost too quiet to catch. I should have called the sea turtles. You don't say anything, because really, what could you say? At this point, you've passed beyond boredom and circled back into awe. The sheer commitment, the glacial pace of escalation, the poetic absurdity of a god dragging every ounce of his divine authority into a standoff with a clam who has now definitively, confidently opened. Yes, for the first time, the clam is fully ajar. Inside, a shimmer, a glow, not just a pearl, but a cluster small, smooth spheres like tears from ancient storms. They hum faintly, a sound just on the edge of hearing, like old lullabies sung through deep current tunnels. Poseidon freezes. He was not ready for this. What? He says slowly. Is that supposed to mean? The clam doesn't answer, obviously, but the message is clear to everyone watching. This is no ordinary clam. This is a relic, a keeper of something old and unspeakably calm, a being that remembers when Poseidon was still figuring out how to part seaweed with flair. You feel the crowd shift in tone. Where before they were amused, now they're reverent. A few anemones bow, or at least slump deeply enough to give the impression. Even the jellyfish stop dancing and slowly turn inward, pulsing like flickering lanterns at a wake. Poseidon frowns. You're just trying to distract me. The clam gleams in reply. And then, because this moment demands a declaration, Poseidon draws himself up and announces, Very well, since you've chosen to flash your ancestral trinkets, I shall respond in kind. He extends a hand. A faint rumble passes through the ocean floor, a whirl of silt stirs, and from behind him emerges what looks like an ancient scroll made of woven sea nettle and coral bones. He unrolls it theatrically. This, he proclaims, is the official deed to this geothermal shelf. passed down from the Trident Council of the Pelagic Dominion. You squint. It looks suspiciously like it was scribbled on the back of a squid wrapper. Poseidon holds it higher, signed by Delphinus III, on the 8th tide of the 8th moon. Historians still argue whether Delphinus was an actual legal authority or just a dolphin with an unusually sharp dorsal fin. Some accounts say he tried to marry a sea fan. Others suggest he was Poseidon's imaginary friend during a particularly lonely century. The Clam is unimpressed. In fact, it closes slightly not out of fear, but out of mockery, a slow, subtle. I've read better fiction gesture that is felt by every watching creature. Poseidon is fuming now. You deny the legitimacy of the Dominion. You question the sacred rights of deep-sea inheritance law. A barnacle somewhere laughs, not loudly, but it's enough to set Poseidon off. He slams the trident into the sand. The seabed shakes, not a lot, just a minor tremor. Enough to tip over a coral sculpture and send one poor crab spiraling into a kelp tangle. Enough to silence the crowd. The Clam holds firm, and then utterly composed, it does something so shocking, so audacious, it freezes Poseidon in place. It releases a tiny puff of water, a precise, targeted stream, not harmful, just moistly dismissive, right in Poseidon's face. He reels, not physically. Gods don't get knocked over by puffs, but spiritually, egoically, crushed. He wipes his face with a kelp rag and glares. That, he whispers, was unacceptable. And then you feel it before you see it. Poseidon starts building a wave. It begins as a tremor in the far dark, like a storm practicing its entrance. It grows fast, curling, gathering heat from the vents, pulling in stray fish and anxiety. This isn't a tsunami. This is a message, a divine tantrum sculpted in water. You back away slowly, watching the shape form, a perfect, spiraling wall of ocean wrath coiling toward the Clam. But just before it hits, the Clam closes, not defensively, not to brace, but calmly, serenely, as if to say, not today. The wave crashes over, sand flies, bubbles scream. The crowd scatters. You shield your eyes. And when the chaos clears, when the bubbles settle and the silt drops like underwater dust, you look, the Clam is still there, unmoved, unchipped, and somehow even shinier than before. Poseidon stares. The wave did nothing. You feel something shift in him. Not rage, not sadness. Something more dangerous. Doubt. Poseidon is not used to losing. Even when he technically loses, he finds a way to spin it into a win. Tsunami wipes out your city. He'll say it was a spiritual cleanse. A flood ruins your crops. You're welcome. Salt detox for the soil. But this is different. He didn't just lose a round. He summoned the full force of his elemental might, an artfully coiled divine wave, and it did nothing. The Clam remains exactly where it began, nestled in warm sand, bathed in sunlight, radiating utter serenity and the kind of judgment you only get from sea creatures with no facial features. You float in the stillness, letting it all soak in. Poseidon drifts slightly higher, arms folded, beard drifting like angry smoke. He's mocking me, he mutters. With his stillness, you want to argue that stillness isn't usually a weapon, but in this case, he's not wrong. Poseidon hovers, arms twitching. That's it. No more negotiations. And with a dramatic swirl of his trident, he conjures blueprints. Yes, floating diagrams made of sea foam and squid ink. Charts, zoning maps, legal documents you'd expect from a coastal civil engineer who also happens to be emotionally unwell. The god's tone changes. Let's discuss divine real estate law. Shall we? He taps one of the blueprints. A glowing model of the seafloor springs up, a miniature version of the trench, complete with thermal vents, lighting angles, and a tiny clam made of sand. This is my domain, he says, not just by power, but by precedent. Look here, see that faint curve? That's the Trident Meridian, declared holy by the Saltwater Commission during the trial of the Finned Inquisitors. You blink. Was that real? Historians still argue whether the trial of the Finned Inquisitors was an actual tribunal or just a particularly spicy game of underwater charades. Fringe researchers claim it was all a metaphor for Poseidon's complicated relationship with dolphins. The Clam, as always, does not care. But something happens next that changes everything. From the darkness of a nearby ridge, another clam appears, slightly smaller, duller shell, same aura of withering disinterest. It slides not fast, not urgent but with purpose, and plants itself beside the first clam. The crowd gasps. Poseidon flinches. Oh no, not you. You squint. What are you missing? The new clam opens slowly. It doesn't shine. It doesn't puff. It points. Well, if pointing can be done by shifting half a shell slightly toward the east, Poseidon follows the angle and groans, because now a third clam arrives, then a fourth. One by one, clams begin to appear across the seabed, all eerily identical in their ancient calm. Each one takes a place like they've been summoned, not by Poseidon, not by the audience, but by the situation itself. You feel the energy shift. This isn't just a petty standoff anymore. It's becoming a movement. Poseidon shouts, "This is an unlawful congregation. I invoke the shell-gathering act of 721. One of the clams releases a sound so faint it registers as an emotional cough. Even the octopus with the clipboard looks up now. "I'm sorry," he says. "Did you just try to evict clams?" Poseidon snaps. "Yes, under divine mandate." A sea anemone swoons. The octopus scribbles rapidly. This is going in the transcript. Poseidon's nostrils flare. "You have no jurisdiction. You yelled that at a sponge last week." The octopus replies, "You're not sure who's winning anymore." Poseidon stares out at the field of clams, each perfectly motionless, perfectly neutral, and yet so aggressively there. They've created a pattern now. A spiral, a slow, sacred geometry of shell. It radiates from the first clam outward like a temple diagram. As if they planned this. Poseidon finally breaks. "You're staging a protest." Silence. Over a vent. The original clam opens slightly and releases a small bubble. It winks. The sea loses it. A dolphin spits out a coral flute. A sardine faints. The jellyfish begin glowing in time to the clam's beat, like backup singers at a revolution. Even Orpheus the sea cucumber rolls back into view, somehow more wrinkled than before. Muttering, "Saw this in 67. Didn't end well for the eel king." Poseidon is livid. "I will not be mocked by an ocean floor flash mob." You quietly applaud in your mind. Because at long last, this is not a god versus clam. It's a god versus idea. And the clam is winning. You don't remember when the argument stopped being about the vent, or the sunbeam, or even respect. At this point, it's about control. Poseidon is spiraling both metaphorically and literally, as he circles the growing assembly of clams like a very dramatic shark with a superiority complex. His trident pulses with annoyed light. The sea itself, once calm and glowing, now ripples in uneasy waves that nudge coral and toss sand like disgruntled sighs. But the clams, they remain still, anchored, silent. Each one is perfectly placed, forming what scholars now call the shell spiral of defiance. A sacred geometry so balanced that even passing sea turtles slow down just to admire the symmetry. It's hypnotic. It's unsettling. It's the kind of design that suggests ancient intelligence or a mollusk with a really aggressive sense of feng shui. Poseidon tries to recalibrate. He pulls out his final card. With a grand, sweeping gesture, he summons an echo from the deep, a vision, a watery memory replayed in shimmering light. The surrounding sea dims, as if the ocean is holding its breath, and in the darkness, you see a projection shimmer to life. A council chamber made of coral and pearl, a gathering of sea creatures in ceremonial garb, a squid in a monocle, a grouper wearing a judge's hat somehow, and in the center, Poseidon, younger, confident, holding a shell marked with a golden trident symbol. This, Poseidon intones, was the signing of the Sardine Treaty of Thalassia, the moment I was granted eternal dominion over all geothermal vents in the Western Trench. You watch. The vision is blurry, water-warped. The squid wobbles. The judge hat tilts dangerously. Then, a sardine floats into view, wearing a crown, tiny, sassy. He clears his throat and says, "All in favor of giving Poseidon the vent rights." Say, blub. Silence. The sardine raises a fin. Motion passes unanimously. Meeting adjourned. The projection flickers out. Poseidon turns proudly toward the clams. You see, legal, binding, witnessed. The clams do not react. One slowly turns its shell about 3 degrees counterclockwise. Possibly a shrug, possibly a threat. You can feel the tension now. Because if this myth were a play, and frankly, it is, this would be the moment just before someone knocks over the last domino. And then it happens. From the southern trench shelf emerges a single creature. You didn't even know they still existed. A giant sardine. Gray, wrinkled, wearing the same crown from the vision. It floats forward, ancient and slow, as if time itself gave up trying to rush it. Poseidon freezes. The sardine clears its throat and says, in a voice so gravelly it probably contains fossils, you misquoted the treaty. Poseidon blinks. What? The clause. The sardine repeats, was about geothermal vents used for ceremonial kelp steaming, not sunbathing. You got the copy with the grease smudge. You hear a gasp ripple through the sea. Poseidon stares. Are you saying I've been wrong for 3,000 years? The sardine nods solemnly. Yes, it happens. You were loud about it, so no one corrected you. The god of the sea deflates. Literally, his shoulders drop. His trident dims. He suddenly looks not small, exactly, but human, just for a moment. The crowd is silent. Even the jellyfish pause mid-pulse. One clam opens, just slightly. Another bubble rises. You wait. Poseidon turns slowly toward the clams, and then softly, quietly, like the end of a storm that never quite made landfall. He says, fine, keep the vent. You exhale. He floats backward, toward a ledge of basalt, and sinks onto it. The trident hovers beside him, pulsing softly like a nightlight with social anxiety. The crowd doesn't cheer. They don't jeer. They just exhale a collective sigh of long overdue release. Historians still argue whether this was Poseidon's lowest moment or his greatest act of restraint. Some say it showed the limits of divine ego. Others say it was the beginning of a new age of underwater civic discourse. Fringe theorists insist this is when clams gained political consciousness. You watch as the ancient sardine turns and drifts away. No fanfare, no curtain call, just a trail of bubbles and a faint scent of kelp wine. Poseidon picks up a nearby pebble and tosses it into the sand. I was going to name that vent after myself. He mutters, Pose vent. You nod slowly. That's terrible, says the octopus without looking up. The clam opens once more. This time, the bubble it releases splits in two perfectly balanced, perfectly timed. A final punctuation mark. The sea has gone still in that strange, post-argument quiet. The kind of silence where nobody wants to be the first to speak in case the tension grows a second head. You're floating between a sulking sea god and what now appears to be a fully unified clam syndicate, who have reclaimed not just one vent but the entire emotional high ground. Poseidon hasn't moved for a while. His trident floats nearby like a depressed compass needle. A jellyfish tentatively bumps into it, thinks better of it, and drifts away like a dinner guest who stayed too long. You glance at the clam council, which now forms a shape not unlike a shell-based amphitheater. At the center, the original clam remains still basking in the sunbeam. Like none of this was ever about Poseidon at all, which, in a way, it never was. Poseidon finally breaks the silence. Do you know how many temples I've had built in my name? You don't answer. It seems rhetorical. 47. He nods. That I know of. Probably more. If you count the ones with really lazy stonemasons. I had sacrifices, choirs, sea foam murals. He turns to the clam. And you. You sit there, say nothing, do nothing, and somehow you've turned the entire ecosystem into your personal theater troupe. The clam opens briefly and closes. Not a bubble this time. Just a pause, a dramatic beat. Poseidon growls, that wasn't even a sentence. And then, because no underwater dispute is complete without another surprise witness, a coral formation speaks up. You didn't think coral could speak, but this one can. The outer ridges of the reef shimmer, and from within emerges a soft, crackly voice like wind dragging sand across stone. We, the Coral Tribunal, have convened. Poseidon's face tightens. Oh, not you guys. The coral continues, unbothered. We have reviewed the events. We have watched the footage. We have read the ancient algae scrolls. Historians still argue whether the Coral Tribunal is a legitimate authority or just a very old rumor that got out of hand during a sea cucumber festival. Their only known ruling until now was a strongly worded complaint about overgrazing by starfish. The coral glows slightly. We find the clam in alignment with the laws of the deep. Poseidon throws up his arms. What are the laws of the deep? Nobody ever writes them down. We do, says the coral. But in slow calcium, a pause. So slow. One anemone whispers. It takes 100 years to form the word however. Poseidon is beside himself now. This is madness. I created this rift. I named this shelf. I once turned a leviathan inside out just to win a bet. Yes, the coral says. And yet, the clam did not blink. Poseidon turns back to the clam. The silence now feels heavier, less like resistance and more like an offer. A gentle suggestion that maybe, just maybe, he doesn't need to win. Maybe no one does. You see it on his face, a flash of something very ungodly. Exhaustion. He lowers the trident, lets it sink gently into the sand. The blue glow fades. The temperature in the water dips slightly, back to something neutral, peaceful. A dolphin clears its throat. Poseidon says slowly, retiring my claim. A gasp ripples through the spectators. Even the clipboard octopus stops scribbling. I do so, Poseidon adds. Not out of defeat, but because I have other matters to attend to, like, fixing the undersea aqueduct near Atlantis. It's leaking. No one believes him. The clam. The clam opens again, ever so slightly, and for the first time turns not much, just 5 degrees to the left, away from the vent, away from Poseidon. Poseidon watches, and then, with surprising grace, says he's giving it back. The Coral Tribunal murmurs. It is a gesture of equal ground, mutual yield. Poseidon exhales. I don't deserve it. The clam stays still. Poseidon gives the faintest nod. I'll take it anyway. The crowd begins to disperse, slowly, respectfully. No bubbles, no celebration, just the slow current of myth settling down. You feel the ocean exhale, not loudly, just gently. It's over. Or maybe finally it's begun. The undersea theater empties like a tide pulling back from an overstayed picnic. Creatures drift off in pods and clusters, exchanging glances and inaudible gossip, recounting what they just witnessed, what they think it meant, and whether Poseidon really looked like he might cry there for a second. You stay a little longer, because something's shifted. And it's not just Poseidon's mood, it's him. He's not pacing anymore, not radiating threat. His shoulders aren't quite so square. In fact, he seems small. Not in stature, he's still enormous. Trident, taller than a sea stack, but in presence. You watch as he kneels beside the clam, not groveling, not inspecting, just resting. The trident is half buried in the sand beside him. The light from the vent glows against his skin, painting him in warmth that's no longer his warmth. It belongs to the space again. He speaks without looking up. I never wanted this place because of power. The clam opens, slightly. Sure. Initially, it was about dominance, but that was before I noticed the way the light lands here. The way it bends around the ridges. A pause. There's peace in it. You're not sure if he's talking to the clam, to you, or just to the sea itself. But the words drift like silt, soft and strange. I thought owning it would preserve that peace. Lock it in. Keep it sacred. Another pause. But maybe you were already doing that. The clam emits a low, humming glurr that somehow sounds like exactly. Historians still argue whether Poseidon actually communed with the clam at this point, or whether he was finally talking to himself in a way that mattered. Either way, something softened, something cracked. Poseidon lays back against a stone ridge. You're shocked to see him relax, not like a god at rest, but like someone who's finally stopped pretending they were never tired. And then, as if summoned by the emotional vulnerability in the water, a small fish swims up. A tiny, bright blue blenny. It stares at Poseidon, cocks its head, and says, "So, does this mean you're, retired?" Poseidon opens one eye. What? Just asking. The blenny shrugs. There's a big vacancy in the furious sea god category. I know a starfish who's interested. Poseidon sighs. Tell him to send a resume. The fish nods solemnly and swims off. You watch as Poseidon smiles an actual smile. Small and sheepish. You didn't think he had one of those The clams haven't moved. They don't need to. Their work is done. The spiral still glows faintly, like an ancient rune or a very tired sundial. And then comes the final surprise of the day, a current soft, warm, laced with lavender-scented silt curls around Poseidon and lifts him gently off the sand. It's the kind of current that invites, instead of commands, a motion without force. The clam opens again, just enough to release one last, perfectly round pearl. It floats toward Poseidon. He catches it, turns it in his hand. Is this an apology? He asks. The clam closes slowly. Poseidon chuckles. You're insufferable. He places the pearl gently back on the sand beside the vent. I'll leave it here. Let others wonder. And then, without further grand gestures or myth-making monologues, Poseidon rises and begins to drift away. He doesn't look back. He doesn't need to. The clam returns to its posture, still centered, not victorious, just present, and the spiral remains, an underwater fingerprint left by patience, pride, and a 3-day emotional duel between God and mollusk. You rise too. The light from the vent flickers softly now, casting long shadows across the reef. Fish return. Seaweed relaxes. The sea breathes again. And beneath it all, the clam sits, unshaken, unwritten, unbothered. Somewhere in the distant gloom, a whale sings not the loud, mournful kind, but a sleepy baritone humming something that might be jazz, or just a very old thought taking a lap around the trench. You float in place, caught in the silence left behind. The vent glows steadily, unclaimed now, uncontested. Not because it lost its value, but because, for the first time, it feels like everyone agreed it wasn't theirs to own in the first place. The clam, ever still, doesn't gloat. No banners wave, no choral fireworks, just the faint sound of current drifting through the shells, like wind through a wind chime that forgot it used to be royalty. Then, without drama, without spectacle, a sand dollar rolls in. Yes, just rolls. Uninvited, unglamorous. A little late. It bumps gently against the edge of the clam spiral and stops. A few grains of sand puff upward like confetti thrown by someone too polite to cheer. You glance around. Nobody else seems to notice. The jellyfish chorus has fully dispersed, some drifting toward warmer waters, others fizzling out like forgotten party balloons. The octopus with the clipboard is now resting upside down on a rock, snoring softly into an inkwell. Orpheus, the sea cucumber, has returned to his traditional state of miscellaneous lump and shows no sign of future participation. And Poseidon, gone. No swirls of divine departure, no booming farewell, just gone. For a god who once flooded an entire archipelago because a poet mispronounced his name, it's honestly the most dignified exit he's ever made. You wonder what he's doing now. Swimming in open water, staring into clouds from beneath the waves, rewriting the chorus to his theme hymn. Whatever it is, it doesn't feel angry anymore. The clam. Let's not forget the star of our myth has shifted about 2 inches to the right. A small thing, but monumental. Because for the first time since this began, the clam has chosen movement. Scholars still debate the meaning of this gesture. Some argue it's a symbolic redistribution of mollusk presence. Others think it was just more comfortable there. Fringe theorists believe this was the second clam all along, and the first was simply excellent at illusions. You settle beside a rock and think, this entire episode, this bizarre, slow, sun-dappled spiral of egos, silence, and bubbles might just be the quietest revolution in divine history. A god challenged, a clam unshaken, and something changed. Not in the big, thunder and oaths kind of way, but in the quiet correction of cosmic posture, like the sea straightened its back just a little. A fish drifts by, stops. Hey, it says, is the vent still warm? You nod. The fish settles above it with a happy wiggle and says, good. I had the weirdest dream just now. Something about a singing starfish and a tuna lawyer. You pat the rock beside you. Yeah, that happened. A long pause. The fish says, weird day. You both stare at the clam. The sunbeam above it hasn't moved. If anything, it seems brighter now. Or maybe you're just noticing it differently. Another clam nearby yawns. Loudly, somehow, and then, because someone always starts it, A slow murmur rolls through the seabed. Stories being told, not formal ones, just whispered retellings from fish to shrimp to sponge to coral. Did you hear about the clam that outlasted Poseidon? Did you hear how it stared down a god? How it turned silence into a sword? How it made the sea stop and listen? No one's sure what's real and what's embellished. The timeline is already muddy. Some say it took 3 days. Others say it was a week. One eel insists it was only an afternoon, but felt longer because of the jellyfish opera. It doesn't matter. What matters is the telling, and the telling has begun. By now, the myth is out of your hands. It's been spun into 1,000 shimmering versions, none of them quite accurate, but all of them true, in the way myths tend to be. Exaggerated, misremembered, and somehow more honest than the facts they replace. You drift among the new tellings. A young pufferfish claims the clam shot lasers from its shell. A moray eel swears Poseidon wept pearls. One dramatic sea urchin insists the entire reef changed color during the climax, though that may have been from eating expired algae flakes. Each retelling gets a little louder, a little more confident, and somewhere in the chaos of creative retconning, someone gives the clam a name. Celeria. It doesn't mean anything, really, but it sounds ancient. And that's enough. You find yourself beside a small sponge colony that has started reenacting the event using coral puppets. The Poseidon one has an oversized trident made of tooth coral and a beard made of stringy kelp. The clam is played by a pebble in a tiny robe. The dialogue goes something like, "You dare. Bloop. Then I shall flood the sea. Bloop. I respect you now. Bloop." It's not accurate. It's not even good theater, but the audience is riveted. Nearby, a group of dolphins are forming a band called Clam Rebellion. Their first single is rumored to be a 7-minute ambient track featuring shell percussion and angry echolocation loops. It's already being called mollusk core. You return to the vent. It's quiet again. Not empty, just calm. The spiral of clams has mostly dispersed, leaving behind only the first few, including Celeria. The sunbeam now glints off its shell like it's posing for a painting you'll never see, in a gallery that only exists in dreams. Poseidon doesn't return. Not today, anyway, but you feel his presence in the way the tide curves gently around the ridge, like someone brushed it with a respectful hand. A nod. A final punctuation mark that no longer insists on being an exclamation point. And then just when you think the story is done, a distant rumble echoes through the trench. Low, rhythmic, familiar. You turn. The Sardine Council has arrived. Not a myth, not a hallucination, a genuine, ancient school of sardines wearing ceremonial seaweed sashes and tiny, judge-like barnacle hats. There are at least 36 of them, swimming in a slow, synchronized spiral, as if tracing the outlines of forgotten treaties. One of them, clearly the leader, swims forward and clears his throat with the sound of wet sand being stirred by an overconfident crab. "We," he begins, "have come to review the matter." You blink. "Now, we convene only when summoned by myths," he replies solemnly. You glance at Celeria. She has not moved. But you're pretty sure she just rolled her metaphorical eyes. The sardine leader continues. "We have reviewed Poseidon's claim, and the clam's resistance, and the jellyfish interpretive legal ballet, and the spontaneous choral tribunal." He pauses, "and the snack cart." Then, dramatically, we find the clam, within her rights, by the ancient code of the sea's still voice. A hush falls over the trench. The code hasn't been invoked in centuries, mostly because no one remembers it exists until someone needs it. The sea's still voice, the sardine says, declares that any creature capable of resisting divine confrontation with nothing but silence shall inherit dominion over the contested space. Temporarily, until bored, a few shrimp clap quietly, someone hiccups. The ruling is final. The sardines vanish as quickly as they appeared, spiraling upward into shadow, dissolving like bubbles into the lower fog above. You're left with a feeling you can't quite name. Not satisfaction, not peace, something like recognition. Celeria shifts ever so slightly in the sand. You whisper without meaning to. "Well done." No response. Of course, but a single pearl rolls from her shell, not flashy, not glowing, just present. You place it gently on the vent and let it sit. Not as a trophy, but as a placeholder for whatever myth comes next. You remain at the vent a little longer. Not because there's anything left to see, but because it feels wrong to leave too soon. The ocean, for once, isn't rushing you. Everything has slowed. Even the light seems softer, less like a spotlight, more like a whisper that's lingered too long in the water. Celeria is still there, not triumphant, not transformed, just steady. That's the thing about clams. You realize they don't rise. They remain. They don't change the current. They let it flow around them, slowly reshaping the world with their refusal to move. And the world, it seems, is finally catching up. A few young sea creatures begin to arrive, drawn not by drama, but by curiosity. A cluster of parrotfish take turns trying to imitate Celeria's stillness. One keeps giggling. A shrimp tries meditating beside her and immediately falls asleep. No one's claiming the vent anymore. No gods, no declarations, no interpretive jellyfish. Just life. You turn and notice the jellyfish, by the way, have begun to choreograph again, not in protest this time. They drift in lazy spirals above the vent, glowing faintly with no apparent audience in mind. Maybe they're just dancing for themselves now. And that, you think, is probably the healthiest thing they've done all day. You swim a slow circle around the old site of the spiral. The sand remembers their pattern, the imprint of ancient stillness. Even the rocks seem to hold the memory. You imagine, years from now, someone might find this place and feel the ghost of something large and quiet and slightly ridiculous. They won't know the whole story, but they'll know something happened here. You pause near a bit of seaweed snagged in the coral and notice a small carving. It's not much, just a rough shape, a circle with 3 dots in the middle. It's either a clam or Poseidon's beard. Either way, someone remembered. You check the currents. They've changed direction. Not violently, not even noticeably, just a half-degree shift in flow. But the whole reef feels different because of it. Historians still argue whether this moment marked the rise of what would later be called the Great Pause Era, a time when disputes were settled more with silence than storms. Some credit the clam. Others say Poseidon's withdrawal was a political move after poor PR. Fringe scholars, naturally, believe the whole thing was staged by squid diplomats hoping to distract from a Kraken scandal. But the truth, the real truth, you're not sure there is one. There's just the vent, the sunbeam, and a clam who sat long enough to outlast the sea's fury. You rise up, letting the current carry you, not far, just high enough to see the bigger picture. Below, the reef resumes its rhythm. A turtle naps in a kelp cradle. A school of anchovies argues about whose cousin saw it first. A coral polyp releases a puff of spores, just because it's Tuesday. And in the center of it all, the clam remains, quiet, unchanging, unapologetically present. There's a stillness that comes at the end of a myth. Not the loud kind, not the celebratory kind, but the kind that settles in your bones like warm sand after the tide pulls back. You drift above the trench one last time, watching the layers of silence fold over themselves, quieter than before, deeper than before. Down below, Celeria hasn't moved in hours. She doesn't need to. There's no Poseidon pacing circles, no sea cucumbers rambling, no sardine tribunals waving ancient kelp scrolls. Just the faint hum of the vent, the soft hush of mineral-rich water whispering through its stones, and somehow, that hum feels like a lullaby now. You glance around the reef. The cast has dispersed. The octopus with the clipboard has opened a small bookstore under a ledge, its first title proudly on display, Negotiating with Gods, a clam's guide to emotional endurance. It's written entirely in bubbles. Early reviews are promising. The jellyfish have gone minimalist. No more flashing. No choreography. Just long, slow pulses as they drift like floating punctuation marks in an argument that's finally ended. And you feel the weight of the story pressing gently against your ribs. This whole thing, it wasn't about dominance, or territory, or glory. It was about outlasting, about knowing when not to speak, when not to move, when the most powerful act of resistance is to do absolutely nothing and mean it. Historians still argue whether the clam's silence was wisdom, stubbornness, or just total indifference. But the myth has already escaped them. It belongs now to the whispers between sea fans, to bedtime stories told by shrimp, to mural fragments painted in barnacle spit and coral dust. You look back one more time. Celeria sits in the center of it all, lit by that unwavering sunbeam, a single gleam resting against her shell, the pearl Poseidon left behind. It hasn't rolled. It hasn't faded. It simply is. You let the current carry you upward. You pass clusters of reef fish sharing versions of what happened. In some versions, the clam spoke. In others, she levitated. One particularly dramatic retelling insists she opened and swallowed Poseidon whole, then spat out his sandals in defeat. You don't correct them. You just float on. Because you were there. You saw what happened. You felt the silence stretch across hours and tides and temper tantrums. And in that silence, something sacred lived. It wasn't victory. It wasn't compromise. It was endurance. And somehow, that was enough. Word count. Lutwoods. Snidey. 300 word wind down. Now, let yourself drift. Let the last echoes of the reef fade beneath you. The bubbles slow. The warmth of the vent gives way to a gentler current, carrying you softly, steadily away from the clam, the god, and the quiet war they shared. There is no more movement now, just the long hush of the sea holding its breath up above. The surface is far, far away. The light doesn't reach you here, not sharply. It filters down like memory, like the distant shimmer of something already fading into legend. You don't need to understand it all. You don't need to remember every detail. You only need to feel the stillness. The same stillness that outlasted fury, outlasted pride, outlasted even the storm Poseidon thought would settle everything. It didn't, but silence did. And now you're part of it, tucked into the story like one more drifting shell in the spiral. Let that quiet hold you. Let it settle into your limbs. The world above can wait. The tides will shift again, but not yet. Not now. Now is for closing your eyes, for letting go of the need to interpret. Now is for softness, stillness, sleep.